We'll start the show at 2 o'clock.
Yes, 2 o'clock your time. Yep, and folks are entering the meeting as we speak, so we'll just give folks a couple minutes to join us. Okay. All right, and for participants who are joining us, please feel free to pop up in the chat box and say hello wherever you're joining us from tonight, so we know where you're watching from. We always get a great crowd from all over the country when we do these. All right, we've got Spokane, Washington, Leesburg, Virginia, Los Alamitos, California, and Madison, Wisconsin. Great. Pam from Richmond, hello. Arlington, Virginia. That's always so much
group
fun
tonight.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I just love seeing where everyone's from.
Yeah, I love seeing left coasters.
We do have a few of those.
Yeah. I think we're getting ready to secede.
All right, we've got
Connecticut.
Yes, Enfield, Connecticut, Champaign, Illinois, New Jersey. Awesome. That's great. All right, well, with 30 participants so far, we may have a few extra joining us as we begin. It is now 5 o'clock East Coast time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Emily Voss. I am the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. And this is our Constitution 101 series. And this is our opportunity to take kind of a deep dive into some kind of more specific constitutional issues that we don't normally get to spend a lot of time with. So this evening, I am delighted to introduce Jack Rakove as our guest speaker. Jack Rakove is the William Robertson Coe Professor of History and American Studies Emeritus at Stanford University. He's the author of 6 books, including Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America, which was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the past president of the Society for the History of the Early American Republic. He frequently writes op-eds for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major newspapers. And his most recent work, Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience, The Radical Significance of the Free Exercise of Religion, has just been published. And that will be the subject of Dr. Rakove's talk this evening. So participants, I would encourage you as we go, please go ahead and if you have questions along the way, please use the chat box feature or the Q&A feature. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions, and then as Dr. Rakove has opportunity, he will be stopping for questions and we'll get some of your questions answered along the way. So with that, Jack Rakove, please take it away.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Emily. Welcome to all of you. I have to start, Emily, with a mild correction. So my new book, which I'm holding up here, is actually my 8th. And plus the others I've edited. And I'm now working on my 9th, being a native Cubs fan, doing everything in 9s is always fun. So we're going to have a long talk this afternoon on the free exercise of religion, one half of the religion clause, which of course is the first clause of the First Amendment. The religion clause says Congress shall make no law respecting and establish a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And what I propose to do is to give a kind of rapid fire summary of essentially the five chapters of my new book, Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience. And I think I'll break this down into two parts. The first part will be deep history, by which I mean essentially some reflections on 16th, 17th, and 18th century developments, down to and including the era where James Madison and Thomas Jefferson became the leading proponents of the free exercise of religion as a fundamental constitutional principle in American history. And then we'll take a short break near the top of the hour for the usual purposes, and and then come back, and we'll devote the second time to talking about some issues of doctrine in the 19th, 20th, and now the 21st century. I'd like to try to cover as much ground as I can in, let's say, maybe 35 minutes or so, but we'll play this by ear, and to see what kinds of questions or concerns or problems or issues, or for that matter, points of confusion are coming up in the chat box, and try to deal with them as best I can. I have to say, after 45 years of teaching, I'm fairly famous for never being able to get through all my material in the requisite amount of time. It's a problem being a historian, is you're always gathering more of it. But I promise you we'll cover a lot of ground. And if I'm going too fast and there are things that need further explanation, please let me know. I mean, the book was written for scholarly audiences, but I've written a number of books for the trade, as trade books, meaning aimed at the general reader. So I've always tried to strike a balance between academic scholarship and contemporary discourse. And just for the record, I'm sitting in my study on the Stanford campus, where we actually had a thunderstorm last night, which in August is rather weird for the Bay Area, but we're living, as we know, in strange times. So let me start. I think I'll just start at the very beginning with explaining the title of my book. So the full title is Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience, the Radical Significance of the Free Exercise of Religion. Radical significance is, I think, a fairly powerful term, and I think it's worth explaining why I imported it into the title. So I think basically there are 3 points I want to make here. I mean, the first is that as I think about it, the right to the free exercise of religion, the second half of the religion clause of the First Amendment, is in a certain sense the most liberal right of all. When I say liberal, of course, I don't mean it in the contemporary political context. I mean it in more of the classic 18th and 19th century context. And what I mean by this is it's the one right which places the greatest premium, which makes the greatest investment in our individual moral autonomy. It's the one right that says in an area that is traditionally deemed as fundamental to all human behavior, the right to believe what you want to believe about matters in the world to come, or aspects of the supernatural or the spiritual, whatever, that each of us has a sovereign autonomy over what we choose to believe or not believe. And it's an autonomy with which the state cannot really interfere unless, of course, we do certain overt acts which are punishable on other grounds. It's important to compare that kind of right with, I think, most of the other rights that we think of as forming part of our, let's say, libertarian tradition in the Anglo-American constitutional tradition. Most rights, when you think about them, are essentially procedural in nature, in the sense that when a government, or let's say a polity, agrees to honor a right, what it's not saying is that your behavior is wholly exempt from the realm of legal supervision or regulation. Essentially what it's saying is government has the authority to act, but when it acts, it has to act in conformity with some known and fixed set of standards that dictate or indicate the government's going to act fairly. The free exercise of religion really goes beyond that. It really exempts our concerns from regulation of any kind. So it's not really procedural in nature. It identifies a fundamental basis of autonomy that each of us, to quote the Old Testament, man and female, he created them both. Each of us, male and female, and as I try to argue in the book, also I believe children as well are entitled to exercise. The second point, it's actually tied a bit more to the Establishment Clause than it is to free exercise, but I see the two clauses as working together fairly integrally. The whole American theory of constitutional government rests upon the premise that all the power the government exercises rests originally in some act of delegation by a sovereign people through the form of a social compact or a compact of government. And if you ask the question, particularly in terms of 17th and 18th century constitutional thinking, were there any realms of behavior the government could not regulate? The short answer would be no. The authority to legislate, the authority to regulate, the authority of government to act was essentially plenary in its nature. There was no aspect of human behavior that lay beyond the realm of government regulation. So that when you reach the point by the 1770s and 1780s, where Americans are prepared to disestablish religion, to say not only we have a right to free exercise, but also that government itself is going to get out of the religion business. We're going to take that off the table of public regulation. We're not going to provide public support for religion. We're not going to fund it. It's going to be, in that sense, a wholly voluntary, wholly private activity. That's a radical step constitutionally, because now you are identifying an area of fundamental importance that's going to be beyond government regulation. So that's my second point about what makes it so radical, right? And the third point that I think all Americans as Americans should understand is that we can argue that the distinctive pattern of American religious behavior, which followed the process of constitutional formation, represents our own radical contribution, our own radical solution to what I'll call the religion problem, meaning that the premise of Jefferson and Madison's thinking, that recognizing free exercise of conscience and getting government out of the business of regulating religion, far from sapping or weakening the capacity of religious entities, religious denominations, would actually strengthen them, would actually encourage and not impoverish the development of religiosity. So we're therefore thinking historically about this problem, we have to recognize one of the fundamental facts of American history. It's the very process of disestablishment of free exercise that made possible the great spiritual competitiveness, what we call the kind of spiritual marketplace of 19th and 20th, and I suppose 20th, 21st century American religion. There are many reasons why that situation existed, but having them embedded in the Constitution was a guarantee that they would become a permanent part of our constitutional system. So now I'm going to take a quick break because it's hot out here. So now, for the next, half hour or so, give or take, plus ou moins, I'm going to double back and go over the points that I want to make, and I'm going to elaborate them in some scholarly detail. And again, if I'm going too fast, or if I say things that are confusing, or if you have your reactions, feel free to chat, and Emily will monitor the chat box and be able to help me along when we get near the close of the hour. So let me start by talking about the European background. So I have three kind of points I want to develop now, and one is to talk a bit about the European background, talk a bit about notions of toleration and tolerance in European history in the 16th, 17th, early 18th century. I want to say something also about religiosity for the colonial Americans in the period before Jefferson and Madison became our leading constitutional spokesman, and then I must say something about Jefferson and Madison. So when I get to chapter 1 of my book, I make an observation that I think is actually kind of nifty. I think I make a lot of nifty observations, but I'm really happy with this one. And this one says, when one lives, as I think we do, in a tolerant society, we no longer know what tolerance really means. That's kind of the puzzle, or it's a kind of neat little puzzle or paradox about living in the kind of society in which I think, and I hope we continue to live. Because it has to do with what do we actually mean by toleration? When we live in a tolerant society, we think it's pretty easy to be tolerant. We're trying to be tolerant in our schools. We're trying to be tolerant in our schools. There are some parts of American culture where these ideas are not wholly popular, but I think it is a dominant value. The Americans like to think of ourselves as being religiously tolerant. We'll take people of all faiths. We'll give them a common stake in our constitutional project, and we hope and believe and have reason to think that we'll all become good Americans. The problem with this is if you ask what did the concept of toleration and toleration being the idea, and tolerance being the practice. So toleration in a sense is an idea or a public policy. Tolerance is the actual behavior that implements a theory of toleration. It's how we deal with one another, in fact, on the ground, in our daily life. The key thing about toleration is historically what it means is to accept a burden that one really finds distasteful, offensive, It is a burden. To tolerate someone with another belief is not a happy practice. It means to accept something you find distasteful, or to rely on a book I make some use of in my own book by a wonderful English scholar, Alexander Walsham. It's a form of charitable hatred. It's both charitable, but it also rests on, on feeling profoundly alienated from that which you're tolerating. So it's a kind of great puzzle, I think. It's a kind of a good starting position is to say that for Americans to become who we became, to become believers in free exercise as opposed to toleration. In a sense, we were going beyond religious toleration. We've reached a point where the other religious practices that by which we're surrounded, which represent beliefs with which we are not individually in agreement, are no longer hateful to us. They're no longer things we despise. Historically, that was not the case. When Europeans began to work out both ideas of toleration and modes of tolerance, very slowly, very gradually, in a very limited way, in the 16th, 17th, early 18th century, they were dealing with ideas that they continued to despise. And it was a very difficult process. And it was always fraught, it was always prone to being broken up. Now, when you think about this, to us, it seems, now seems like a rather perverse or, awkward or whatever way to behave. At the time, it actually made a lot of sense. If you think about the importance of religion to civil society, if you think about the idea that you want to have a kingdom unified around some common set of beliefs, if you recognize that religion has this enormously divisive potential, you would never want to abandon the authority, the capacity of the state to regulate religion out of some moral commitment to free exercise. Getting rid of religious aliens, or getting rid of dissenters, tolerating for a while, but then revoking their toleration if you got to do it. Those were perfectly sensible policies. So that, for example, when the newly unified Spanish monarchy in 1492 expels the Jews who would not convert and become what were called in Iberia New Christians, as offensive as that was or remains to Jews, that was in its own way an enlightened policy. It's in a certain sense, it's a successful formula for building a modern nation state. Same thing's true if you look at what happened in France in the late 16th and late 17th century. Back in the 1590s, after the horrible civil wars that had disrupted French life in the second half of the 16th century between the Huguenots or Huguenots, depending on how you want to pronounce it, between the French Calvinist Protestants on the one hand and the Catholic monarchy on the other. The late 16th century, the Edict of Nantes was issued as a kind of tolerationist accommodation with the existence of Protestants. But the French monarchy always wanted to abandon that principle when it felt it could afford to do so. A century later, in 1685, it revoked the Edict of Nantes. There was actually a kind of Huguenot diaspora which emerges from this. It actually has a big impact on Western thinking. I think it's actually an early case of what we now call human rights thinking. John Locke was much impressed and spent a lot of time thinking about that. But the revocation of the edict actually made a lot of sense. By the way, actually, the modern term refugee comes out of the experience of the Huguenots. They took la refuge. They sought la refuge. They sought refuge in foreign countries, mostly in Holland and in England, and actually some in colonial America. John Jay and Henry Lawrence's, who were presidents of Continental Congress, 1778, 1780, 1779, were of Huguenot descent. To be a refugee meant originally to be a Huguenot seeking peace outside his native region. But that revocation made a lot of sense. And even when one starts to think about toleration as a sensible practice, in the way, let's say, that John Locke, the author of the famous essay on toleration, which had a big impact on both Jefferson and Madison, even when Locke tried to develop, on philosophical grounds, a sustained rationale for the principle of toleration and for practices of tolerance, Locke famously exempted three categories from the groups he wanted to tolerate. First off, he exempted atheists on the ground that if you don't believe in a judgment in the world to come, Yolam Haba, to use the Hebrew expression, if you don't believe in judgment in the world to come, that there'll be, that there will be a final divine judgment to kind of supplement or a judgment in this world, you can't be a reliable subject in the world in which we live. In a certain sense, I mean, Locke's ethics depended on the belief that fear of divine punishment remained a core principle of Locke's philosophy. So you don't have to tolerate atheists. You also don't have to tolerate Catholics. Although this is a subject that Locke continued to actively debate, but at least when he wrote the letter, the problem with Catholics, beyond the fact he found some of their beliefs to be, to put it mildly, problematic, was also that they owed their loyalty to a foreign prince, meaning the Pope in the Vatican. So they could not be reliable subjects. And third, as a general principle, you didn't have to tolerate people who did not believe in toleration. So Locke is an interesting figure. Again, he had a big impact on Jefferson and Madison. I'll say something more about this a bit later on. Because on the one hand, philosophically, he works out a basis for religious toleration, thinking this is a fundamental right that ought to be respected. But in some respects, his exceptions or his exemptions remain quite striking because he still has, let's say, civic grounds or civil grounds for limiting how far he wants the principle to go. So it's important, hold on one second. That's why I like to say, thanks, I needed that, to take the characteristic movie expression. I think it's important to have the European background in mind because the first puzzle we face thinking historically is to ask how Americans move beyond it. And that's to say, Americans by the 18th century, on the eve of the revolution, before Jefferson and Madison became our foremost constitutional spokesman, Americans had already come to believe that the idea of toleration per se, as it was traditionally defined, was something they were putting behind them. That to take the title of a book by a guy named Chris Bennick, I've used a lot, Beyond Toleration, became in a sense the leading edge of American thinking. So free exercise and toleration are not synonymous terms. The free exercise of religion implies a realm of behavior and belief that is not, that accepts toleration in a certain sense as an initial principle, but says we can now move beyond it. Okay, so my second thing is I want to talk a bit now about the colonial Americans, the American colonists, 17th and 18th century, on the eve of the Revolution. And I think my starting point here is to think that, it'd be a big misconception for us as patriotic Americans to think that when our various ancestors, may not be biologically, but let's say politically, nationally, whatever. My family's only been here for about 110 years. So, I can't trace my bloodlines, back to the colonial period by any means. But when our ancestors, the American colonists, speaking broadly, when we think about them as seeking religious freedom, it's important to note that the religious freedom they sought was meant mostly for themselves alone, was not a general principle. They were profoundly committed to ideas of religious liberty, but they did not see this as a general principle applicable to all other denominations. Many of them, of course, particularly in New England, I'm going to come back and talk a bit more about New England in a few minutes. Many, of course, were ardent Calvinists who were, caught up in what was a very kind of rigorous, intellectually refined, in some ways very complicated theology. They were, which they felt in a lot of ways should supplant some of the dominant beliefs prevalent still in Protestant Europe. So we can't assume that, when we think about the Pilgrims seeking religious liberty, that they did so on broad libertarian grounds. They wanted it for themselves. They didn't want it for other dissenters. The classic example of the victims, let's say the objects of this kind of attitude in the 17th century, in a sense, the antecedents for Latter-day Saints or Mormons in the 19th century, or for Jehovah's Witnesses in the 20th century, The real problem, I mean, the classic example of the groups they wanted to discipline or punish or exclude would be the Quakers. Now, actually, I've had a partly Quaker education. I went to Haverford College, which is a Quaker school out on the main line of Philadelphia, and I'm a proud Haverford alumnus for lots of reasons. And when I was there, we had to go to 4 Quaker meetings a month. They're kind of slow. You kind of sit there, waiting for the divine light to move someone to speak. So I have a certain attachment to Quakers. 17th century Quakers during their founding period were not like the Quakers who we envision when we buy a box of Quaker Oats, or when we think about 18th and 19th century variations or whatever. They were profoundly offensive. They went out of their way to offend virtually every other denomination or anybody else they encountered. They would not do hat courtesy. They would not perform the traditional courtesy of tipping your hat to people of superior rank. Sometimes they'd like to go, naked into other people's churches to denounce what was being preached and taught. They were truly, in a certain sense, and I don't mean this to be disparaging, but they were truly offensive in terms of their behavior. In Massachusetts, this was an episode that continued to echo for decades and decades to come. When Quakers showed up in the late 17th century, coming, from William Penn's Pennsylvania, and, turned out to be offensive. They were warned out, they were told to leave, and when they persisted in staying, the Massachusetts authorities, I forget if I think it was hanging, but they actually executed 4 of them. A century later, when John Adams and Samuel Adams went off to the First Continental Congress in 1774, they had a meeting with Philadelphia Quakers, and they had to take a lot of grief and a lot of anger over what had happened, back in the 1680s. It was still, that episode was still rankling in Pennsylvania memory. So we can't start, when we think about the significance of the American colonial experience, we cannot start by assuming that we were committed to religious freedom as a general principle and on non-discriminatory grounds from the outset. That simply was not true. And yet, by the middle of the 18th century, it was coming to be broadly accepted that Americans weren't in effect committed to a kind of tacit or latent regime of free exercise. There are lots, and there was no one simple explanation for how this happened. The variety of factors came into mind, and if this were a real history lecture, I could spend the rest of my time identifying them. I'll just kind of tip them off if we would. First off, you had a lot of demographic diversity, just in terms of how colonies were settled. People recruited from different areas. They start moving across the landscape on various kinds of opportunistic grounds, seeking economic opportunity. So practical matter, you have to find ways to coexist with people of other beliefs. Secondly, they were contentious Protestants, precisely because they were so well informed in theological terms. They were given to argument. And of course, if you're a scrupulous Christian, there are lots of things you can argue about. You can argue about whether or not one should be baptized as a child or baptized as an adult. You can argue about transubstantiation. You can argue about the meaning of the communion. You can argue about which sacraments one ought to take. You can argue about whether or not the minister should be called by the members of the church, should be installed with the permission of other members of the clergy of his faith, whether ordinary citizens in the town meeting should have some say in his selection. You could try to evaluate his preaching and teaching, which of course could always be a controversial subject. And there are, of course, lots of matters of doctrine you could disagree about. You're also operating in a cultural environment where it's sometimes argued the press, not that there are a great number of newspapers, but where most printers, the guys who actually ran the press, were open to contributions from all comers, where in fact they kind of fostered a freedom of debate in the public sector. So it's also important to note the impact of the Great Awakening, which is the great religious revival that began around 1740, and sometimes we antedate it to 1735 in the preaching of Jonathan Edwards, who was, I guess if I remember correctly, Aaron Burr's grandson of Solomon Stoddard, a great Puritan minister of the 17th century, Aaron Burr's grandfather of the 18th century. The Great Awakening had a powerful splintering effect on the existing denominations, particularly obviously the Calvinists. The one other point I want to mention here, and it's one of the arguments I try to make in my book, and I have to do just a bit of New England religious history, is that it also seems to me that the free exercise of religion meant a great deal in American colonial history because the great emphasis the New England Puritans placed on the experience of conversion, meaning in a sense the rebirth in Jesus. That is to say, to become a full member of a Puritan church, starting in the 1630s and 1640s in Massachusetts and Connecticut. One had to give public testimony, public, and I should add, convincing testimony of one's experience of, I was going to say salvation, probably not the best term to use here, but having a kind of conversion experience, and in effect, acquiring true saving faith. Acquiring a full and confident belief in Christ's teaching and the meaning of the crucifixion, and the idea of membership not only in the kingdom of saints in this world, but also in the world to come. That became, in many ways, the defining definition of the radical edge of American Protestantism: the ability to testify in public and to convince others, starting with the godly few who are already members of the church, and then with the rest of the community, that you had undergone this very rigorous, in some ways very daunting experience. And I think the significance of this is, well, it operates at many levels. For one thing, if you know anything about the history of New England Puritanism, this turned out to be a very difficult process to kind of transmit from generation to generation. I won't get into the details of the halfway covenant of 1662, but in effect, you can write a kind of life cycle of Puritan belief, which revolves around just how well this whole doctrinal notion of conversion and public testimony to it was working. Since the Great Awakening in the 1740s was an attempt to go back to the original Puritan experience of the 1630s. The halfway covenant was an attempt to figure out what was going wrong when when members of the second and third generations, that's to say the children of the original immigrants and their children, the grandchildren of the original immigrants, were not having the requisite experience and the requisite confidence to come forward and give that testimony. I think this really matters because in a radical sense, it empowered individual believers, people who retained Christian beliefs but were somewhat doubtful or nervous or anxious about their own spiritual experience. It gave them a terrific anxiety about exactly what form of preaching and which set of doctrines and which set of beliefs and whose teaching they ought to follow. In other words, it really, in a certain sense, it empowered ordinary believers to have to decide these matters for themselves. Because as John Locke and others argue, you can never coerce religious belief. You can coerce outward conformity. You can punish people. You can abuse them physically. Lock them up, beat them, whip them, threaten them with execution for heretical beliefs. But belief is a matter of interior conviction. And the God, I think, particularly that Locke imagined us worshiping, but I think that in many ways more radically Protestants worship, that God wants us to reach a sense of religious conviction through the force of our own convictions. And we have to do that on our own. We get a lot of assistance. We should listen to preaching, we should read the text, we should ruminate about it, we should talk with others. But in the end, it's the experience of faith is an interior conviction. And I think that privileging, that emphasis on this interior process had the radical consequence of making American Protestants in the 17th, 18th century deeply conscious of the importance of their being competent to decide for themselves. So that's the deep background. Okay, that's the colonial part of the story. Now let's add Jefferson and Madison. I say a question here about who are Pilgrims and Protestants. Actually, I'll do that pretty quickly. The technical difference here is Pilgrims and the American Puritans are both part of the same Calvinist. Blank out the right term here. They both come out of the Calvinist traditions of the Puritan movement. The basic difference between them does not lie in their theology, does not lie in what they believed. It really lies in the question of how they thought about the Church of England. The mainstream Puritans, the guys who settled Massachusetts, remember the Pilgrims are essentially down in southeastern Massachusetts and out on the Cape. You have to go down the Southeast Expressway, to kind of, pass South Boston. The Pilgrims essentially Pilgrims were separatists, meaning they no longer accepted the Church of England as a legitimate church. So in effect, they had expatriated themselves or whatever for the Church of England. That's why they went to Holland in the first place. And then worried that their kids would be assimilated in Holland, they went to the New World to set up their own refuge. Mainstream Puritans, the guys who settled the rest of New England, outside of southeastern Massachusetts, were non-separatists, meaning they accepted the legitimacy of the Church of England, notwithstanding the persecutions they'd been suffering in the early 17th century, which of course were behind their own migration. So I hope that's enough. It's just, I used to spend a lot of time with Stanford students, since to be honest, I'm not a Christian myself, explaining who are the different denominations. It's one of the things I had to learn. I always felt the day I could teach predestination was the day I really earned my salary. In a certain sense, I think that's still true. Okay, so I hope Martin and everybody else that that answers your question. Okay, let's get back to Jefferson and Madison. And I'm going to spend, it's 2:35 my time, so I'll spend another, I think maybe 10 to 15 minutes on those guys, and then we'll see if there are any more questions come up. And if not, we can take a break and then we can come back. Is that okay with you, Emily? You think we're on pace here? I don't like to make that sign anymore. It's been discredited. Okay. I want to start with an important distinction. I mean, I think the set of points I just made goes to argue that in a certain sense, the impulses toward accepting not toleration, but free exercise as the governing basis of our notions of separation of church and state, I think they were deeply embedded in American culture before the Revolution, before 1776. And so they don't depend, as a matter of causation, they don't depend upon the fact that Jefferson and Madison, with their remarkable Virginia birthplace and perspective, added their personal views and authority to this cause. That's to say, there was a deep basis for the American position before Jefferson and Madison came on the political scene and started to articulate in constitutional terms the significance of this issue. Nevertheless, it seems to be quite important that the fact that they did so has had important consequences. When you go, and I'll say something about this in the second hour, when you look at the leading judicial statements of church-state doctrine that we have, for example, in the Reynolds versus U.S. case, which is the Mormon marriage case from 1878, 1879. And when you look at some of the religious freedom cases, from the mid-20th century, the reliance on Jefferson and Madison runs pretty deep. That's to say, their positions are taken to be authoritative. And, it's a good question. In my book, I say, I'm not sure they're authoritative. I mean, they're important guys for obvious reasons. And, I've spent most, really a career now of half a century. I mean, I first started working on Madison and Jefferson back in the early 1970s, or so I could say back during the Nixon years. It's important that they said it. And I think it's important that we wrestle with it because, as I said at the very top of the hour, because it's a real intellectual significance to their constitutional commitments. Okay, so it's not that they're the most representative thinkers, but they were seminal thinkers, and we're still wrestling with their ideas and with the logic behind them. Okay, so let's do a bit of the Virginia story now. So first off, hold on one second. Both of these men were well educated. Actually, I'll tell a little story here. Since Emily has her Montpelier backdrop behind her, every time I've been on the board of Montpelier for I guess something like 9 years now. I think this is my last year coming up. Every time I go there, and I go there a lot, and I'm always delighted whenever it happens. what I'm always reminded of is to think, and the same thing's true when I go to Monticello, I think of, here are these two geniuses, because I think that's a fair way to characterize them. Great thinkers in their own way, leading the life of the mind in a provincial backwater, and kind of what my mentor, the late Bernard Balin, who died just a week ago, 9 days ago, described as the marshlands, kind of the frontier of the British Empire. So here are these two brilliant guys, spending so much of their time just in their studies, in their, what they would call their closets, reading their immense libraries. And I think, in a certain sense, that's a good point of departure for the argument I want to make, because I think, for starters, both Jefferson and Madison, who were deeply learned, not self-educated, of course, they were college educated. Madison at College of New Jersey, later Princeton, Jefferson and William and Mary, both really the stars of their colleges. They carried with them a deep intellectual commitment to the principle of religious freedom. It was something they had thought long and hard about, even as young men. Madison, when he went back to Orange, Virginia, went back to Montpelier in the early 1770s, got involved in protecting, Baptist preachers who'd been arrested for preaching without a license. I think in nearby Culpeper County. Jefferson had the same experience. So it starts off, they were deeply educated in the literature of religion. They're deeply educated in theology, particularly Madison, in politics. They knew their history, and so on. They had a deep intellectual commitment. They first met, and the next point of departure is Madison's first public act. As a young man, he was at that point just 25 years old. He served in the 5th Provincial Convention in May 1776, which drafted the first Virginia Constitution and the Declaration of Rights, which accompanied it. Madison's first public act was to get an amendment in the religion article. I think it's Article 16. Well, they're different drafts, but eventually Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It had been, as George Mason originally drafted, it had been a tolerationist article. And Madison turned it into a free exercise one. In other words, toleration, if you think about it, I should have made this point earlier. The idea of toleration means the state is giving you a legal privilege, which it can choose to revoke. The idea of free exercise says this is a right that we possess. Really, it's a matter of property, something we own, when ownership is a strong legal concept. Madison was already committed to that principle before. So Madison's first great success was to get the religion article of the Declaration of Rights amended when he's at the 5th Convention in May 1776. He met Jefferson about 5 months later in October, when they both went to the first session of the new Virginia Legislature, and they were both put on the Religion Committee. And we know at this point that Jefferson was living at the home of his college instructor, George Wythe, who was the kind of famous law professor in Virginia and had also taught at William and Mary. And he used Wythe's library, and he went back, he read or reread Locke's letter concerning toleration. And he writes about Locke, he says, it was good to go as far as he did. As Locke himself says, of the Parliament, which passed the Act of Toleration, which was an English statute from 1689. But then Jefferson adds, but where he stopped, we may go on. And the idea of going on means, in other words, again, beyond toleration, toleration is no longer enough. Okay, so they started wrestling with this issue in 1776. They came under a lot of pressure from the dissenters in Virginia, who were mostly Presbyterians. A lot of them were descended from the Scots and Scots-Irish, well, mostly Scots-Irish immigrants who were settling, in the Shenandoah Valley, kind of over the mountains from Montpelier and Monticello, down towards Stanton and towns like that. So the dissenters, who were militant Presbyterians, not accustomed to taking many prisoners in their theological disputes, they wanted to push the principle to disestablishment. There was more than the dominant Anglican ruling class. I mean, the Virginia ruling class was still Anglican, meaning members of the Church of England, which would then become the Episcopalian Church, since Church of England would no longer be suitable for patriotic Americans. But so most, the Virginia, the leadership class of Virginia were still Anglican or / Episcopalian in their sympathies. And, the established church still derives certain benefits from, from that condition. So the whole process of disestablishment was not something that they could have done in 1776, but they're under a lot of pressure to do it. And so what happens then? Well, Jefferson, Jefferson wanted to spend most of his time A, at Monticello, and B, with Martha, his wife, who of course died in 1782 and plunged Jefferson into deep depression. So Jefferson actually spent a good part of the Revolution before he was elected governor just back in Monticello, working on a comprehensive revision of the Code of Virginia laws, which is actually is Jefferson's great visionary project to redraft the whole Virginia legal code so it's consistent with Republican principles. And what is arguably his most famous measure was the Virginia Bill, or later Statute for Religious Freedom, which is a very curious legal document. I don't have time to describe it in full detail, but it has a long preamble, which is pure Jefferson, talking about all the horrors and religious persecution as imposed in the past. And it has a relatively short statute, which basically disestablishes the Virginia Church. It has a relatively short second paragraph, which is actually the real statute itself, which basically disestablishes religion in Virginia. It says nobody can be compelled to pay anything to support any minister or any church. So it just makes all churches voluntary associations in terms of how they're organized. And then it has a curious kind of appendix, which says that because this is only a statute, he knows that the statute can be repealed by a later legislature. But if the statute's ever repealed, that'll be a violation of natural right. So don't do it. In a sense, was Jefferson's message. And Jefferson drafted the bill. But of course, there was a war on. The Virginia House of Delegates had no time to talk about all these reform measures because it was too busy doing all the things necessary to win the revolution. So what happened then is when the revolution was over, 1783 is when the peace treaty is finally signed and so on. And Madison was term limited out of the Continental Congress and comes back to Virginia. Madison sets about the process of getting Jefferson's bills reenacted, or Jefferson's revised Code of Virginia's laws enacted. And what happened then was that with the support of Patrick Henry, who was the dominant personality in Virginia politics, there was a measure was introduced, sometimes known as the General Assessment Bill, which said it would be fine to support religion, all religious denominations, meaning it'd be fine to have public support, to levy taxes to support all religious denominations on what we now call a non-preferential basis, meaning any denomination could benefit. Madison was deeply opposed to this because he felt this was still a form of religious establishment. Felt religion should be inherently private in nature. And so Madison kind of gets the assembly to stall a year. He drafts a famous memorandum anonymously. I mean, his authorship was only disclosed many years later, called the Memorial and Remonstrance on Religious Assessments, which is a kind of leading statement of Madison's principles. The Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians, who were kind of all growing, groups, start to petition. Presbyterians kind of wavered on this because for a while they wanted the money, but then they followed their principles. So in the end, the legislature did not enact the General Assessment Bill, and instead Madison could finally get Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom enacted. And that's seen, I think, correctly as a landmark piece of legislation. I mean, it is an antecedent for the First Amendment, for the religion clauses of the other state constitutions, and so on. So I think it's that point, once you have the statute enacted, that and you have this kind of, particularly Madison's memorial behind it, that we have, and Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia and so on, that we have more of a kind of documentary basis for articulating and figuring out what Madison and Jefferson's principles were. I think one of the things I do in the book is I try to describe the similarities and the differences between them, which I think are really important. On fundamentals, there's no question that they were in deep agreement. That's to say, they both favored the same set of outcomes. They wanted religion to be privatized, to be made a matter of individual choice and vocation and decision. They wanted churches to be wholly, to depend, to have no legal connection to the regulatory or the financial authority of the state. They too should be wholly privatized. But there was a curious difference between them. Jefferson had we know something about Jefferson's theology. I think Jefferson, in a certain sense, had probably ceased to be a Christian in the Orthodox sense of the term. That's to say, he no longer believed in the divinity of Jesus Christ. He was, in 18th century language, a Unitarian, or you'd also say a Socinian, Socinian. It's a technical term I won't bore you with. But Jefferson is famous for, he kind of came up with his own version of the gospel, which basically purged all the revelation and all the miracles out of it, and treated Jesus as a sublime moral prophet, whom we should all study and emulate, and whose teachings we should essentially follow, but not as the Messiah. Madison was much more private about his religious belief. Madison, I think, as a young man, was deeply religious. After 1776, we just don't know. Madison stops talking about religion as a matter of belief. He doesn't discuss theology in any active sense of the term. I see a couple of questions are popping up, so I'll try to save a couple of minutes for them. I think the difference between them is Jefferson believed that we should have Americans would all become Unitarians, not members of the Unitarian Church again. They'd all come to accept his belief that Christ was a sublime prophet, but not a Messiah, or certainly not the Son of God in any serious sense of the term. Madison, of course, he living long enough to see the Second Great Awakening, which revives all those deep tendencies. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Jefferson was somewhat disillusioned by what actually happened. Madison was much more philosophical. It was central to Madison's position. It's a big part of Madison's constitutional thinking to argue that the best security for liberty in a Republican society, lowercase r Republican society, is not to assume that every citizen will have the same virtues, and virtues a key term here, will have the same characteristics. Madison, as he famously argued in Federalist 10, argues that actually the best security for liberty is diversity. And the best example of how diversity works lies in the realm of religion. Madison says what's really made the Americans, since he's drawing a bit on Voltaire, the French philosopher, talking about England back in the 1740s, but Madison reformulates the idea. Madison argues that where you have religious diversity, everyone, where no sect can dominate, no denomination can dominate, everyone will acquire a common stake in protecting religious freedom. If you have a diversity of interest, let's say in the economic realm, where no one can dominate, that too will provide will provide a basis for stability. In Madison's language from Federalist 10, it will help to cure the mischiefs of faction. So Jefferson gets profoundly depressed about how things are going. Madison was actually profoundly optimistic. Madison says, look, everybody warned us back in the 1780s, if we disestablish religion, it'll be a terrible situation. That, religion is important and the churches need public support. If we disestablish it, who knows what will happen? He said that was the position we opposed. We said, actually, if you disestablish it, if you privatize it, in fact, that's going to be the best. That'll be the best solution that we can have. And he takes that thesis, which originally comes from the realm of religion, and applies it more generally. So if any of you are serious Madison scholars, remember what you learned in college or high school. If you go back and reread Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, you'll see how the religion link comes into play. Okay, let's do.
If we could have you answer Alan's question, which is there anything in the writings of either Madison or Jefferson about their attitudes towards Jews?
Yeah, there's not very much. There's a little bit. There was one member of the Frank family to whom Jefferson took kind of disliking. I think the key, but I think in general, I think their position was that Madison says this in Moral Remonstrance. He says, look, instead of being kind of narrowly parochial in our religious prejudices and trying to maintain solely a Protestant society, again, we're going to privatize it. Any religion is acceptable. We want to open up. He says as a moral remonstrance, we want to open up America to other, to members of other faiths. I mean, how else will they be exposed to the truths of Christianity? I'm not sure he really said that in a kind of missionary, in a missionary context. I mean, I think the real genius is privatization was not just a matter of. I mean, I think the story I try to argue in the book is that American attitudes are first and foremost about Christians tolerating and accepting each other. It's not about their attitude towards Jews and Muslims. I think it mattered a lot that there's only a few thousand Jews in America at the time of the Revolution. There are only a few thousand Catholics. All the disputes that take place are really about Protestants arguing with one another about the proper basis of about regulating religion. But they were, in a sense, they were, I could say, more Catholic. They were more ecumenical, you could say, Irenist in their orientation. They were willing to, I think the idea of opening American society to people of multiple faiths was something that Jefferson and Madison were entirely comfortable with. Okay, so at this point we'll take, it's 5 minutes of the hour, so we can take five to six. And we'll resume right after, right after the top of the hour. Okay, I'll be back. Thinking, not a trivial matter. The record, if you read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, if you look at that first preambular paragraph to the Statute on Religious Freedom, if you read Madison's Memorial Remonstrance, that history of religious persecution was familiar to them and deeply disturbing. They wanted Christians to stop slaughtering each other and occasionally other peoples as well. Okay, so I hope that answers the question. Lynn Horn asked a question. Ellie's book on Madison's religious liberty. I used to have it here. I think it's back in my office. It's a good collection. I mean, now I think it's somewhat dated, but it's not a bad place to start. Okay, so let's talk. So I have another 56 minutes plus or minus left. So I want to talk about the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And I guess so first and foremost, let me just say a little bit personally about the book. So I am, as you can tell, I'm first and foremost a historian of colonial and revolutionary America. But the series to which my book is a contribution is meant, actually a lot of it's meant for legal scholars. And so I needed to put in some stuff on the development of the doctrine of religious freedom, primarily as a judicial matter. So I have two chapters. One I think is called, let me check the title here, The Democratization of Religious Freedom. That's chapter 4. That's essentially the 19th century chapter. And then chapter 5 is called An Era of Doctrines, and that deals essentially from the period from the 1930s down to the present. And so there I have to deal with the kinds of judicial cases that have vexed us. Let me say something first about the 19th century, and I think it'll pick up on what I was just concluding. So I said before, we had the First Great Awakening, which kind of begins in the 1740s and was still echoing in the 1750s and the 1760s. And then there's the so-called Second Great Awakening, which kind of begins, we usually say, the kind of maybe 5 or 6 years into the 19th century and continues to echo, down at least into the 1830s, if not longer. Both awakenings had the impact of multiplying, be fruitful and multiplying, complicating, enlarging the sphere of American religious belief. Again, it's primarily a Christian phenomenon, but on the other hand, large numbers of Catholics who were barely present in 18th century America start to appear in the 19th century, particularly, of course, with the Irish in the 1840s fleeing the potato famine. And of course, there's then also in the late 19th century, the so-called new immigration, which brings large numbers of Jews and Eastern Europeans, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox types, and so on, to America. To my way of thinking, and again, this picks up on Madison's position, is that the basic argument the historians make, and the great book here is, I have a copy, I could find it over here on my shelf, called by a guy named Nathan Hatch, I think is now president of Wake Forest. Hatch, an evangelical Christian who was formerly provost in Notre Dame. That was an interesting thing. And then I think he's now president of Wake Forest, if I remember correctly. So there's a great book called The Democratization of American Christianity. And the basic argument is that once religion is disestablished and free choice of religious affiliation is effectively democratized in a post-revolutionary society, that in effect, we create this vast spiritual marketplace. And one key to religious success in the 19th century is the different strategies that the denominations, both the old churches, but the rising ones, like certainly the Baptists and the Methodists, or actually in rank order, Methodists and Baptists would be the most important, but also groups like the Latter-day Saints, so on and so on. That they're all, they're engaged in this, this kind of complicated supply-demand function of propagating religious beliefs, and individuals are free to choose which church they want to affiliate with. And so I think the idea here is this competition is actually, this process of privatization. It's kind of a Milton Friedman world of an open marketplace that is very conducive to the development of the active expression of religious freedom, so that the free expression of religion, the free exercise of religion, the free expression of religion means that religion is no longer a matter of conscience, what you or I choose to believe individually, or of inner belief. It's now a competitive activity that lots of groups, whether older churches or newer churches, are freely engaging in. And the richness of American Protestantism, the fact that public support has disappeared, that doesn't matter. It's of no consequence. And that's why Jefferson is depressed because, the kinds of religious beliefs he sees flourishing are not the ones he personally, as a kind of 18th century Enlightenment type. It's not exactly what he hoped would happen. It's not that Americans are all becoming Unitarians. There's, as I say in another essay, they're kind of holy rolling and snake handling their way across the continent and creating all kinds of, folk religious behaviors that Jefferson really finds kind of distasteful. But from Madison's perspective, Madison's more philosophical. He says, look, we've solved the problem. Religion is flourishing, and all the corrupting factors that arise when church and state are bound together, we've solved it. It's a great situation. So that's the deep background. The two main issues, doctrinal issues I talk about, well, there are a few things worth mentioning. One thing that's really more of an Establishment Clause issue is there's a big debate in the 1820s and 1830s over whether the post office should be open on Sunday. If you live in a strongly Sabbatarian culture, and meaning where the respecting the Sabbath is a core tenet. Well, obviously for Orthodox Judaism, but also for most Protestant denominations. If you allow the mail would not be delivered on Sunday. Of course, these days we don't know if the mail's ever going to be delivered again anyhow, right? But putting that little quibble aside, if you allow, actually what it really means is there were very few post offices in early 19th century America. You'd have a postal stall at the store. The store master would also be a postmaster or whatever. But if you go to the store to pick up the mail, then you could also get a drink or whatever other mischief will ensue. So there's an interesting debate about whether or not you should have the post office open. Jefferson, as a strong anti-establishment guy, believed that if you close the post office on Sunday, there will be an establishment of Christian faith, and Jefferson wanted the post office to be open. The evangelicals, of course, are flourishing as a consequence of the Second Great Awakening, wanted to be closed because it detracts from the sanctity of the Sabbath. So that's just one concern to have in mind. I won't belabor it. The the two great issues that arise, I talk about some detail, are first, what are called the Bible Wars. And secondly, the whole question of the Mormons and the principle, the principle of plural marriage and what happens in Reynolds versus U.S., which is the great Mormon case, which is kind of precedes Utah's admission to the Union, towards the close of the 19th century. American culture remained deeply Christian, and the Second Great Awakening reinforced that underlying body of beliefs. And if you live in that kind of religiously embedded or religiously attached society, the idea that the Bible is the source of moral truth is a very powerful conviction, and with good reason. I'm not questioning its authority or its importance by any means. So the idea here is once you start founding, as Americans start doing, again, this is a very Jeffersonian exercise. Once you start founding systems of public education, the question of how would you instruct children in moral truths became an important pedagogical issue. Now, if you believe in the principle of disestablishment, and you accept, the vitality and let's say the equality, the civic equality of all denominations, how can you teach the Bible? Would that not itself run the risk of establishing a particular religion? Well, it became a serious problem in Ohio, particularly in Cincinnati. Cincinnati was a great immigrant city. Cincinnati is one of the great frontier cities of early 19th century America. It attracted, not just people migrating from, down the Ohio River, west from Pittsburgh or whatever, but, it attracted, a large number of Jews, the German Jews who started coming. It attracted Germans, Lutherans and Catholics alike. It attracted members of other denominations. So it's an early kind of multicultural, multi-denominational city. And what happens, you have the set of debates in kind of pivot on Cincinnati, which end in a kind of free exercise decision. So the emerging position is that, how can you teach morality if you don't teach the Bible? But how do you teach the Bible if different denominations take different interpretive positions on different passages, right? And that's what, that's what we argue about. I'd like to say about Madison's philosophy in a sense was, turn Protestants loose with the Bible and you don't have to worry about anything else because they'll find lots of things to disagree with, and that'll further that creative factionalism. So the argument here is, on the one hand, you believe, because the deep religious embeddedness of the whole society, that the Bible is a source of truth and you cannot inculcate moral values in children without them being exposed to revelation. On the one hand, on the other hand, you can't do it with any kind of denominational imprint. So in other words, you can teach the Bible simply by reading it, but you can never comment on it. You can never teach it as such, right? That's to say, you could, all you could do would be to read the text, choose the text carefully and read the verses, but you can't actually instruct. You can't provide any commentary, any instruction, use the Hebrew phrase, any midrash on the Bible itself. That becomes a kind of mainstream Protestant belief. In a certain sense, it seems to represent, it's certainly a plausible position. If your starting position is the sanctity of the Bible and it's a source of universal morality, becomes problematic though, in part because Catholics and Protestants don't read the same Bible. That's to say, there's American Protestants are still relying on the King James version of, which dates from, I'm kind of blanking on the date, but the early 17th century. Catholics have an English translation, I'm going to mingle the pronunciation, but done by English Catholics who are resident, I think, at a Belgian seminary at Douai, D-O-U-A-I. I think another 16th century text. Jews, of course, would not, if you have Jews in the schools, I mean, you won't have many, but you will have a few. Obviously, they don't want to read the New Testament, since we don't regard that as, I mean, it's fine for Christians. It's not fine for us, you know. For my first encounter with the New Testament came only when I went to college. I never would have read it previously. Although I did learn some Christmas carols in the Chicago public schools, you know, back in the day. So there's a kind of fundamental problem here, and you get a set of cases. I won't go through all the details, but you know, you get a set of cases where in the end, the Ohio Supreme Court, you know, sides in effect with the Jeffersonians. And Jefferson, and again, what Jefferson Madison had written about religious instruction, religious knowledge back in the 1770s, 1780s became key text for the judicial interpretation of this whole question. So you have the Bible Wars. Again, it's a testimony of the vitality of American religiosity, but it's also a testimony of the vitality of American denominationalism. That you can't. I mean, it's a kind of complicated legal procedure, but in the end, the Ohio Supreme Court comes down on the side of saying, well, you know, we just can't teach it on this basis, so we're going to take the Bible out of the schools. You know, from a Jeffersonian perspective, that's just fine. When Jefferson actually wrote about education, Jefferson, of course, was a great pioneer of public education. Jefferson's principle was, before students are taught religion, they should learn history first. If you're a historian like me, this is a great injunction, you know, to repeat. But Jefferson's idea was that people had to be taught the vicissitudes and the, you know, kind of said the evils that religion had done. The students had to be educated to think critically about religious authority before you could try to subordinate their knowledge or their learning to religious truth. And so the Bible Wars in the 1850s were kind of a great example of how this is developing. There's a second issue, another issue I talked about very briefly was, and this is a kind of technical legal issue, and I'll try this fairly quickly. If you disestablish religion, that doesn't mean that churches cease to have a legal existence, right? They own property. They have members. They need to, you know, somebody needs to govern, somebody needs to regulate how churches act as legal entities. So even while the principle of disestablishment is to get government out of the religion business, nevertheless, you know, as I said earlier, I mean, take it off the table. Churches have a legal status that in the ordinary course of affairs will create lots of vexatious problems. What happens if they disagree over a minister? What happens if churches divide over matters of doctrine, over matters of who gets to occupy the pulpit? And Americans, as de Tocqueville noted in Democracy in America, being litigious by nature, Americans want to litigate it out. What happens then? And a good friend of mine who's written on the, Sarah Barringer Gordon, teaches at Penn, has a great book on the Mormon question. Try to deal with this issue. She says that actually what happens is churches kind of be incorporated. And it's a big development in the history of American corporate law to say that churches, as a general matter, can form charters of incorporation. That doesn't solve the problem immediately, because you still have disputes. And a lot of the legal disputes that took place, judges found themselves in the position of taking lots of testimony about religious doctrine. Who has the better argument? You know, who's better qualified to be a minister? Which faction of the church is most consistent with the principles of the denomination at large? Americans start litigating this, and courts have to resolve the issues. But of course, courts don't want, first courts try to examine the religious evidence, but that places them in the impossible position of having to pass judgment on claims of religious truth, which they're not qualified to do. So in the end, you get a kind of secularization of corporate law. So in effect, the courts are saying we're just gonna look for legal principles. Who constitutes the, let's say the board of overseers or the vestry for any particular church? Who has the right to interpret church properties? We can't look at questions of doctrine. You guys are going to have to work that on your own. All we can decide is who has the legal authority to regulate a church. So that's the second issue I try to talk about. It's technical and complicated. If I say anything more about it, I'll just get you more confused. The Scopes trial is the 1920s. We'll get to that.
Yeah, there's one other question I want to, if you have a moment. From Kyle, did religious problems or religious issues arise during either of Jefferson or Madison's presidencies? So you mentioned the Bible Wars, but that was...
Oh, this was later, yeah. No, not of a, well, there's a, not of a major nature. I mean, there are disputes about, for example, whether you should have days of prayer, like during the War of 1812, which of course was very customary in the 17th and 18th century. I think Madison at one point issued a proclamation not formally ordering one or enjoining one, which that would be a kind of that would be an establishmentarian kind of act. But saying that one might be possible if you want to do it. That oversimplifies a simple question. There are also questions about, of course, they have to do with the relations with Native Americans. You may not believe, you believe in disestablishment and free exercise for the free population. You have to extend it to free African Americans, of course, not to slaves, which is a dicier proposition. The AME Church, American African Methodist Episcopal Church, emerges when African Americans decide they're being treated in a rather condescending fashion by their white parishioners. They form their own church. There's no way you can, you can't prevent them from doing it. You might say it's dangerous, but they're, and they may not have other rights, but one right they have universally is the freedom of religion. So I don't think there are major issues. I mean, there's also a question, once we acquire Louisiana in 1803, should you admit its Catholic population? Again, Catholics are a very small part of the American population. Here you have a society that, whose culture was in many ways Catholic in nature. That's a little bit dicey, but essentially Louisiana is admitted as any other state would be, and so on. I mean, one of the principles I try to follow here is, there's a legal saying that says, Madison liked it, de minimis lex non curat, which means the law does not stoop to trifles. A lot of the disputes we had then and we have now are really about fairly trivial issues. And so areas where we might want to accommodate religion, for example, the court had a big case a year or two ago. I think it doesn't actually involve Bladensburg, Maryland. There's a big cross that had been erected after World War I on public space. It's kind of a memorial cross. Actually, we have one nearby in Redwood City, not too far from where I live, California. So you might say that's a violation of the Establishment Clause. It's on public land. It's, a cross is not a universal symbol of the afterlife or whatever, But it's so trivial. De minimis lex non curat. The law should not stoop to trifles. Maybe it's so far down the boundary, just should not worry about it. You shouldn't, you don't have to be an ACLU First Amendment absolutist on issues like this. I think teaching creationism in the public schools is a rather different matter. And that's pretty substantive. In a way, I think that, kind of some symbolic expressions of religiosity in public space, you kind of get used to it. It's not, it might be slightly offensive. It's not that big a deal. Okay. The big issue, can we cut to the chase again? The most important question in the 19th century from our perspective involves the Mormons, who are a better term would say LDS, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Mormons actually, the term Mormon, like most other terms we use, Puritan, Lutheran, Baptist, those were all originally terms of opprobrium. Those were not the terms that people would choose to identify their denominations. They're the terms basically used by its critics. But they acquire a kind of commonplace value, and so they become, they become standard fare. The Mormons, my good friend Gordon Wood likes to argue, are the most American of all religions. They're the ones that most exemplify all the tendencies that had been evolving in American society before the revolution, in which the revolution, by virtue of its commitment to free exercise, helped to unleash. Because the Mormons, after all, invent their own theology. I discuss in the book, I mean, if we have any LDS listeners, please don't take this amiss, but you can describe Joseph Smith either as a sublime prophet, which is the way one of my students, David Holland, who comes from a prominent Mormon family, has tried to treat him, or Richard Bushman, who's a great historian, on the one hand, or probably one of the worst con men in American history, in terms of what you believe about the stones and the tablets, professed to have deciphered, and then they got lost, and so on. But the Mormons represent a truly purely American church. They come up with their own American version of Scripture. That's to say, the Book of Mormon, which Smith professed to decipher, is a new revelation, which in some ways adds to, but also supersedes traditional Christianity. The Mormons exemplify the way in which opening up the spiritual marketplace it illustrates the way in which the American religious environment was going to operate. Joseph Smith himself is a fascinating case. I mean, Bushman's biography of him is actually two biographies are fascinating books. Smith's theological order. Smith lives in the so-called burnt-over district of upstate New York, the area around the Finger Lakes. Which is settled mostly by kind of emigres from New England, who are deeply imbued with a Calvinist theology, but confused in many ways about its many disagreements, particularly in the aftermath of the First and Second Great Awakenings. So Smith, like many American Protestants, kind of goes from church to church and is trying to figure out which one has the most convincing message, and then either hits upon the idea or is given a great divine revelation, which points him towards a new religious truth. And he preaches that truth both in the United States. Of course, the Mormons did then, as they still do today, do an awful lot of preaching overseas. They attract a lot of recruits to become both Mormons and Americans. But they become a very controversial denomination. They migrate from New York to Missouri, to Illinois, and then Smith is murdered. And then they take their great emigration under the genius of Brigham Young, the phrase I use in the book, the great hijira, borrowing a term from the Muslims, to Utah, which is way off in the Great American Basin, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from everybody else, where they can set up their own kingdom. But Utah becomes American territory. They fall under the territorial government of the United States. And of course, what makes the Mormons controversial is the discovery in the 1840s, we have to go back on the date, of the principle of marriage, meaning the principle of polygamous marriage, which becomes an enormous source of social controversy in 19th century America. It's a great subject of popular literature. It's reviled by every other Protestant denomination. It's perceived as an abomination. And Sarah Gordon, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, the great historian of Mormonism, in her book, The Mormon Question, just says it's seen as one of the twin, in 19th century American culture, it's seen as one of the, quote, twin relics of barbarism. The other relic of barbarism is chattel slavery. So in that sense, in this kind of spiritual imagination, the principle of plural marriage is linked or is on a par with the chattel slavery of African Americans. So Mormons are off there practicing, but they're in Utah Territory, which falls under the governance of the United States Congress, right? And eventually they want to be admitted to the Union as a state. And the Union, is trying to do everything it can legally to repress the practice of plural marriage because it's so profoundly offensive to Orthodox Protestant sensibilities. And the Mormons come up with a test case. There's a guy named George Reynolds who was taking a second wife. And I think they tried it, it's a so-called contrived case, meaning a case that's been contrived. The Mormons thought they could, the Mormons had, they had a powerful basis for attempting to secure their right to religious autonomy within the state of Utah. You have to remember in 19th century America that, or it's important to know that the protections of the Bill of Rights had not been, to use the technical term, had not been incorporated against the states, meaning they were restrictions only on the national government, not on the states. And the states retained the authority to solve religious freedom questions in their own way. The fact of the matter, I mean, if I have to backtrack a little bit here, if you go back in post 1800, religion did remain established in Connecticut and Massachusetts, you know, the two hardcore Calvinist states in New England. It's only disestablished there in the 1820s and the 1830s. But the constitutional authority to determine whether or not religion would be established at all remained a matter of state autonomy. And had, it's an interesting kind of counterfactual question, had the Mormons delayed the discovery of the principle of plural marriage until later, had they been admitted to the union as a state, which they could well have been, and then discovered the principle, and then made it the basis of their polity. It would be pretty hard to tackle that in constitutional terms. The problem was, going back to Smith and then Brigham Young and members of the Mormon ruling class, they had become attached to the principle at an early point. And it had become this great matter of public controversy. I think the federal authorities thought that Mormon women were an oppressed class. They have kind of, in a sense, typical male patriarchal views of this. And that if you gave them the chance to testify, you brought legal cases, they would come forward and testify to the way in which the practice of plural marriage was actually abusing them. That never happened, because again, they were acting on the basis of their own conscience. They were not coerced in becoming Mormons. I'm sure plural, I was a big fan of, was Big Love, the old HBO series. It was a great series for lots of ways, for lots of reasons. Mormons, were attached as a matter of principle. And so when the federal government tried, they set up some legal proceedings that they thought would kind of blow the whistle on the abusive nature of the relationship. It didn't work. The Mormons, for their side, thought they would have a test case that would establish its validity. And I won't go to the details here, but eventually it made its way to the Supreme Court. Case of Reynolds versus U.S., 1870, 1879. Those days, the court would argue. Sometimes the court arguments would go on literally for days. I think the case was argued for 3 or 4 days. And in the end, the court came down with a fairly simple distinction. They said that matters of the free exercise, it's essentially the first significant free exercise case. What free exercise means here is not, is essentially a matter of belief in the right to preach. When it leads to overt acts, when it leads to forms of behavior that the state otherwise regulates, and of course marriage, particularly actually in the Anglo-American Protestant tradition, marriage had been desacralized. We big believers in religious marriages, but legally, marriage is a civil contract between consenting spouses. All the religious stuff, that's fine. But you don't need a minister, you don't need a rabbi, you don't need a priest, you don't need an imam. All you have to do is, once you go to the town clerk or the county clerk and fill out the license and so on, legally, that's a marriage. And it's, subject to legal regulation. And in fact, what the court did, again, and it went back to Jefferson and Madison, they defined the free exercise of religion essentially in terms of belief and expression of religious arguments. But anything which related to overt acts or forms of behavior, which were socially significant or consequential, which marriage obviously is, remained subject to secular regulation, remained subject to regulation by the state. So the ruling, the ruling went against the Mormons. And they kind of, for a variety of economic reasons, they certainly still wanted to get admitted. to the Union. So that's the initial basis for forming church-state doctrine. To me, it's interesting, of course, again, they relied a lot on Jefferson and Madison, as had also been the case in Minor versus Ohio, the big Ohio Bible War case. So to me, it's another way of saying that even though we can't say this is what the Constitution means because this is what Jefferson and Madison thought, QED, we have to follow their beliefs. It's more complicated than that. The case remains that Jefferson and Madison have remained highly influential, have had a big impact on our impressions. So that's kind of what we do in the 19th century chapter. When you get to the 20th century, the case gets more complicated. I mean, we're saying the 19th century, we don't really have we're not, in the 19th century, we weren't really developing a doctrine in the kind of coherent sense of the term. I mean, both the Ohio Bible War case and the Mormon case could be resolved on fairly simple principles. You don't have to draw the kinds of distinctions, the kinds of nuances, the kinds of qualifications, the kinds of exemptions, the kinds of messy details that arise when a whole body of law has to take doctrinal form. That's why law school is complicated, right? You know, because you have to see, you have to read all the opinions and the decisions, look at the different lines of argument, look at the different rationales. 19th century cases at the end are pretty simple cases. They're not complicated. They have fairly simple principles behind them. When you get to the 20th century, it gets more complicated. And so the problem I face in the 21st century, the problem I face in that chapter, not being a lawyer and wanting to write a historian's book rather than a doctrinal book, was how to present this. So basically what I try to do, I mean, I've got about 20-some minutes left here before we call it a wrap, or maybe less than that if there are any questions. You want to answer Lynn Horn's question briefly? How can religion ever be out of? Oops.
Well, so there are two questions that are related.
Yeah.
So with the idea of separation of church and state, which you've just established, for what reason then is there the phrase "in God we trust" on currency, and why are oaths given on Bibles? Although obviously some oaths can be given on other religious books.
Right. Okay. And then there's a question about clothing, if you want to deal with that one. Well, first off, Lynn and others, I'd say that to me, this is a kind of de minimis lex non curat matter. If you're a pure, strict establishmentarian, and actually when Larry Kramer and I taught a course we had the guy, Newdow, we had the guy behind was the In God We Trust case, came down and talked to us. It just seems to be too trivial an issue to worry about. If you're a pure, strong anti-establishmentarian, it makes perfect sense, right? If you want to follow the logic out to its ultimate point, I won't quibble with, I won't dispute the conclusion. I don't think it's worth arguing about. I just say, who cares what the coin says? The Bible oath is more important. There was a serious issue in the 19th century. I mean, the question of affirm, how do you affirm your oath? You don't have to, you're not legally obliged to swear on the Bible. I mean, you are legally obliged to take an oath, and you're legally vulnerable to punishment if you're found to have testified untruthfully. The Bible, for many people, the Bible is felt to be the instrument, it's kind of like Locke saying, without God, how can, it's like Locke on atheists, right? The fear of ultimate punishment in the world to come is the ultimate sanction and will intimidate most people into doing the right thing. But in fact, the key thing is you're legally, by being asked to swear an oath, you make yourself legally vulnerable for swearing an untruth. It doesn't have to be Bible, I mean, so I started, who is it? Yeah, actually, the Republicans are about to elect a QAnon person from Northwest Georgia, blanking out her names. I mean, she's on tape saying, how can you swear an oath of office on the Quran? It's not really a problem. But in any case, so I hope that takes care of that. Acceptable clothing, it was actually the subject of a big case, the Weissman versus U.S. case. Charles Boderer says, "So help me God." Yeah, that "so help me God," I'm waiting for the day when the president says, "I'm not going to say so help me God." It was probably added in the mid-19th century. Washington Irving alleged that George Washington said it. There's no evidence that was the case. It's probably that's probably a later day corruption. On the clothing matter, there is a case of Weissman versus U.S. There was a case in which the Supreme Court rather strangely said that an Air Force chaplain who was, I think actually an Air Force, I think it's a psychologist who was also a chaplain, who was a Jewish Orthodox, wore a yarmulke. The Air Force tried to get him to stop wearing the yarmulke, and the Supreme Court said they have a right to enforce uniformity of clothing, but the Congress subsequently overruled it, and there's a later case upholding that ruling. There's also a case involving the length of a Muslim beard. You could use it to disguise, maybe to hide a razor. That was overturned. I mean, I think the big point to make for Martin and others here is I think there's a big difference between the French conception of laïcité and our conception of free exercise of religion. In the French conception, laïcité, which is a word, I say this at the beginning of my book, you can translate into English. Just have to try to understand what it means. Laïcité says that when you appear in public as a citizen, comme un citoyen français, you have a civic identity which should not be rendered subordinate. You have a civic presence which should not be rendered subordinate to your religious identity. You have a public capacity which appearing in religious garb. So you're not supposed to wear a yarmulke. You should not appear with a, with a headscarf or wearing a niqab or whatever. If you wear a tiny crucifix, that's okay. And the French kind of exempt the Catholics from having to abide by this. The American way of thinking, this is nuts. I mean, who cares what, the French have this whole public ideology about how you present yourself in public as a citizen. We don't have that. I mean, in this sense, I think we're all libertarians. You might ask the question whether, you can't go through, if we ever fly again, if you go through TSA, you probably, when you get a driver's license, you have to have a full identification, right? So there are exemptions. So I hope that helps. Let me add, kind of running out of time. Let me just say something about, so what I do in the book is I have to, there's a set of cases I try to describe. There are the flag salute cases from 1940, 1943, which are interesting. That's where, first one is Gobitus versus Minersville. Second one is Barnett versus West Virginia. These are two cases involving Jehovah's Witnesses, who are a deeply fundamentalist evangelical sect, who kind of like, Quakers in the 17th century, Mormons in the 19th century, make themselves obnoxious to other denominations. But they were great litigators, and they got something like 24 or more cases in the Supreme Court from the mid to late 1930s down into the early 1940s. The flag salute cases remain the most interesting cases. They revolve around the decisions of ordinary Mormon school children, literally kids as young as 10, acting probably on their own conscience, not to stand up and salute the flag. And the flag salute in the 1940s wasn't put your hand over your heart. It actually had a resemblance to the Nazi salute. It was kind of an extended arm. So it had a different patriotic expression. And in the first case, actually the case took 5 years to get to the Supreme Court. The lower courts ruled in favor of the two Mormon kids, Billy and Lillian Gobitus, who were like 10 and 12 when the litigation first began. And Mormons simply believed to render that kind of acknowledgement to a secular authority is to derogate from the authority of divinity. If you read, it's Exodus chapter 5, verse 20 is the relevant text that they cited. So the lower courts ruled against them. When it reaches the Supreme Court, took place right after the fall of France. And Felix Frankfurter, who of course is a secular Jew, very close to Franklin Roosevelt, former Harvard law professor, was on the court. And Frankfurter felt this so this was the lower courts made a terrible decision. He felt it's a legitimate act of state to, legitimate purpose to inculcate civic values, to require every citizen, every school child to pledge allegiance as a kind of, useful support of a proper form of patriotism. All the Mormon kids wanted to do was be to stand up and not recite the pledge. They're willing, they didn't have to say, see, they're willing to stand up and show respect. They did not want to have to recite the pledge because they saw that as swearing oath, in a sense, to a false god. So Frankfurter kind of carried the court in his favor. He was a powerful speaker, and it was right after the fall of France, and he was, he was deeply worried about the consequences of that. The other justices, except for Justice Stone, went along with him, although several of them had misgivings. And then the case became deeply controversial. It took a while for another case. It also became open season on the Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, they were significantly persecuted in towns and cities across the country. Not in big urban areas, but in the kinds of smaller towns and cities where they'd like to hang out and preach. New Haven, Connecticut was one famous case. And so 3 years later, the court, the press denounced it. The administration wasn't crazy about this because this was the period when, under FDR's Four Freedoms in the Atlantic Charter, the United States wanted to present itself as an anti-fascist, also later anti-communist power that would defend civil liberties. If you know Norman Rockwell's famous set of 4 paintings on on FDR's Four Freedoms, you'll find a good illustration of this. So the court came to realize that it had made a mistake. It took 3 years to reverse it, but then that's the beginning of the modern line of jurisprudence, which is important to us. Go back to something I said in the previous hour, because this kind of represents the point, a major point of departure for what we call the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. So this is a critical point. So incorporation means you have to go back. It's a question of whether or not do all the rights, the many rights, not just, protected in the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, do they apply only against the federal government? Do they apply against the states more generally? And so actually you have to go back to 1919, but beginning with some of the free speech cases that come out of the First World War, and then the religion cases which come out of the experience of Jehovah's Witnesses, the incorporation doctrine begins to emerge, and it kind of reaches its kind of full flowering with the Warren Court in the 1960s. The great postscript of this is a case I had some direct involvement with, is the case of Heller versus U.S., which is the Second Amendment case from 2008. I mean, I wrote the historian's brief which basically argued the Second Amendment has nothing to do with private ownership of firearms. It was always about the militia. It had nothing to do with your right to self-defense, which is by far and away is historically the correct argument. I mean, Justice Scalia's opinion, to my way of thinking, is an intellectual disgrace, and that's an understatement. But putting that little quibble aside, so the free exercise cases became an important point of departure for the development of modern free exercise jurisprudence. I then go on to talk about starting actually with the work of my Stanford colleague, Michael McConnell. There's a lot of discussion of the principle, what comes to be known as the principle either of accommodation or of exemption for religious dissenters, and this becomes the concern that dominates the modern jurisprudence. So McConnell, who was taught at University of Chicago Law School, and then was on the 10th Circuit, and then when he was passed over Supreme Court, we got him to come to Stanford, got him to leave the bench and come to Stanford. McConnell's been a major advocate of the idea of accommodation, and a lot of success as a law professor. The idea of accommodation says, that as a culture, we have a commitment not merely to recognizing the free exercise of religion, but to trying to accommodate it wherever possible. Not that we want merely to permit it, but in some ways we actively want to promote it. And there's a set of cases that Mike got involved with. The key one, exemption is logistic wildlife. Exemption is the extension of the principle of accommodation. So that means there may be areas where you might expect religiously connected individuals might be expected to conform to secular law if they have strong spiritual qualms or objections to it. They ought to be exempted from conformity. The most important example of this, I think, are the cases like Hobby Lobby, which come out of the Affordable Care Act, which come out of, and we had a recent one in the last term, where the idea that the forms of, let's say, errors of either contraception or abortion, the forms of contraception and abortion that employers find religiously objectionable, that they say, or forms of contraception that they actually see as being abortifacient, that they should not be required to, this is the Little Sisters of the Poor case, they should not be required to pay insurance, or even to acknowledge any responsibility of any kind at all for being involved with this. So those are the cases that now dominated. So I think the key case to know here, and I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit of a jumble, I'm kind of racing to finish, and I only got a few minutes. So the key case that I think one has to know about is a case called Oregon Employment Division versus Smith. It's a case from the late I think it's 1989. It's a Scalia opinion. It's also known as the Peyote Case, in which two Native Americans who were part of a group of Native Americans who smoke peyote, which is a prescribed hallucinogenic drug in the state of Oregon, were fired. They're members of a kind of alcohol rehab NGO, which prohibits its members from using drugs or alcohol in any form. They use it for religious purposes. They were fired. They asked for workman's comp. The Workman's Comp Board denied them compensation, but the state Supreme Court upheld their free exercise claim. The Oregon Attorney General, a guy named David Frohmeyer, no longer with us, but a guy who I know slightly, he had a Stanford connections. State Attorney General appealed to the Supreme Court, and then Scalia took the case and just ran with it in ways that no one had anticipated. So that when he finally decided the case, the litigators had either said, was this the case we argued? The basic holding in Oregon Employment Division versus Smith is that when you have a statute that was enacted for purely secular purposes, as Oregon's drug laws were, with no religious animus in mind, it had no discriminatory intent or practice. So there was no bias or prejudice behind it. That statute was valid. Nobody had thought that's what they were arguing. I mean, the case, as argued, was much more narrowly drawn. So Scalia and the majority took the case and ran with it, really expanded its meanings. In response to the breadth of their meaning, Congress, so it took Congress 4 or 5 years to do this, actually took Bill Clinton's election, Congress enacted the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, better known as RFRA, RFRA, which has numerous state variations on it. Took a long time for that to be deployed because some of the people behind the case were tied to the American Civil Liberties Union, which was anti-abortion. Catholics worried that somehow this would get tied up with their opposition to abortion. But when Clinton got elected, they knew that no anti-abortion justice would be appointed. The Catholics dropped their opposition and subscribed to the act. So RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, provides a statutory basis for claims of exemption. Meaning that if you feel, it says it wants to extend the boundaries of free exercise to say that where the state is regulating secular activity, drug laws might be one exemption in the Peyote case, but also Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, might be another because it involves abortion / contraception. If your organization or entity has strong religious commitments, you can seek an exemption from the enforcement of that statute. I hope you follow this. Just it's not I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not used to summarizing cases with the same facility that law professors do, and B, it's a bit on the complicated side. In the Hobby Lobby case, or the Little Sisters of the Poor case, and Hobby Lobby is a for-profit corporation that's owned by a deeply evangelical family. So it's not a publicly traded corporation, it's family owned. So they argued their religious conviction. There are three contraceptive abortion-related procedures that they find offensive. I mean, to support them in any form, they find to be sinful in nature. And they say the government, in effect, can't ask us or force us to sin. Little Sisters for the Poor, obviously, have the same set of concerns about their employees. The way I approach this in the book is I actually try to go back, and this I guess will be my last point, I try to go back to the 17th, 18th century situation. And I say, well, so let's assume abortion it's obviously, it has moral dimensions. There are many reasons why one would have an abortion, but it has to be, to some extent, obviously a morally informed decision. As I generalize from the 17th, 18th century background, with its radical devolution of authority about spiritual matters to the individual, again, male and female, he created them both. It seems to me that the decision maker in the kind of Hobby Lobby, Affordable Care Act related context, who's the better decision maker? Would it be the benefactor of the insurance policy or the beneficiary? To me, the obvious way of thinking, given that radical devolution of spiritual authority to the morally scrupulous individual, would be the beneficiary, namely the female employees. And on what other occasion would you say the person who in effect is funding your health insurance has the right to say, I approve some procedures, but not others. I mean, that seems to me a kind of truly radical, and kind of bizarre. I don't know, bizarre is too strong a term, but truly radical. What is truly radical, strange, assignation of authority. But that's kind of where we stand. The other thing to be said is that the other issue that affects us today is the question of, can you plead the free exercise clause to say that the state has no right to regulate religious meetings because there's a public health crisis in the form of a pandemic, which is ravaging our society and economy. I disagree with Justice Kavanaugh on this. I mean, I happen to think that this is a great 10th Amendment question. That one of the 10th Amendment is saying powers not delegated to the national government are reserved to the states or the people. The idea of what was called the 18th century internal police means the authority to act broadly to protect the health and well-being of the entire polity. That's one of the reserved powers of the states under the 10th Amendment. Says Jefferson, to which Jefferson, among others, was deeply attached. So I think, it seems to me that there's the whole point of limiting church meetings is not to repress religion, it's not to repress its free exercise. It's to say that we have pretty good empirical evidence to say that when you allow church meetings to proceed, the net impact to the public health and to the welfare of third parties becomes fairly obvious. So it seems to me that's almost a no-brainer, but because we live in the society we do, we're sorry about it. So it's the top of the hour, 7 o'clock Eastern time, 4 o'clock West Coast time. I'm sorry to say that the Cubs have already lost today, their third game by third one-run lost game in a row. So I'm sorry that it happened, but I hope you learned something about the amendment. I think this is a good book. It's reasonably priced. It's
available at the Montpelier store.
Available at the Montpelier bookstore. So support me, support Madison, support the Constitution. Let's also support Montpelier. I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you to all the participants who joined us today. We will be back with our next Constitution 101 on September 20th. With Gene Hickok, who is the chairman of the board of the Montpelier Foundation. He will be speaking about the executive branch. And then in October 18th, Alexander Kesar from Harvard University will be joining us to talk about the Electoral College, which will be very timely right ahead of the election. So hope that we will be able to see you all at those upcoming 101s. So thanks again, everybody, and you will be receiving the link to the talk probably tomorrow. So, all right, thanks everybody, and thanks to Dr. Rakove. Have a good night.